On these slides, you're going to see red text. That is text that is directly related to test questions, directly related to test material. Blue text is supplemental stuff to help you understand the context of the history. It'll help you remember the red stuff, because otherwise it's like an overwhelming amount of information to memorize. And then the black stuff is FYI, kind of supplemental stuff to make learning history a little bit more fun if you're interested in it. But we're going to focus primarily on the red text for these review sessions and just focus primarily on what is directly testable material. So most important to start off with is the principles of war. They start off with mass, objective, surprise, simplicity, maneuver, offensive, unity of command, security, and economy of force. Think of the acronym MOS, MOUSE. These principles of war are themes that you have to analyze when studying military history to determine why certain battles failed or why they were successful. They should all have these themes. Whether they are executed well or executed poorly, we're going to analyze each battle by looking at how they utilize all of these principles of war. They've also recently added 3 more you should know: legitimacy, restraint, and perseverance. Legitimacy means basically making sure that a battle you're fighting has legal, political, and moral authority. Making sure that the battle you're fighting is ethical, that it's legal, and that it's politically going to make you look good. Using restraint means things like don't killing people who surrender, don't use tactics that are overly brutal, limiting collateral damage and preventing unnecessary force. For perseverance, basically having the guts to get the job done, remaining committed to tactical, operational, and strategic end states, even when conditions are very bad and you're suffering. We're going to see examples of this in some of the battles we study. There's different levels of war you should be aware of. There's the strategic level, which is the most fundamental, basic foundation, like the war, the overarching war, such as the Civil War. Then there's the operational level. The operational level is basically the campaigns that make up the war. For instance, the Red River Campaign, which was a campaign fought in the Civil War that had multiple goals, and it consisted of multiple battles. After the operational level is the more specific, the tip of the pyramid, the tactical level. These are all the battles that make up the campaigns, that make up the wars. Like I said, within the Red River Campaign, there were a bunch of smaller battles. That was the tactical level, the most precise and specific part of the level of war. Next, we have some maneuver examples. Penetration, which means breaking through someone's ranks directly head-on. Envelopment, which is basically like doing California and New York in the squad assaults that we studied. You go forward with a support element, then you have a firing element go around the side, and you envelop them. A turning movement, you rush around and surround them on both sides, and you get them to go in a specific direction that you want them to move into. Line of communication doesn't just mean communication, it means basically all logistics. It means supplies, it means transportation of troops, it means ammunition, it means guns, it means any type of logistical support is covered in line of communication. In some of the battles we study, the goal is to go after lines of communication, typically in guerrilla-style tactics. You don't fight a person directly, you go after their lines of communication, you disrupt their logistical support basically. Which is what the Patriots did in the Revolutionary War, because they couldn't fight the British head-on a lot. The militias had to go after the British line of communications. That's something we're going to talk about. That's directly testable later. But for now, we're going to start off at the beginning. To start off with, American military history, we're going to talk about the differences between the way Indians fight and the way the Europeans fight. The good aspects of the way the Indians fight is that it's a guerrilla style. They use raids and stealth in wilderness terrain. They hide behind trees, hills, rocks, and they fire at you from afar. They're hard to pin down because they have the element of surprise, and they're hard to spot. The bad is that they're not very well organized. There's an individual emphasis, so the Native Americans didn't have a very good battle buddy system. It was kind of every man out for himself. Nobody knew what the other person was doing or planning to do. Everybody just kind of fanned out and did their own thing while hiding behind terrain features and conducting guerrilla tactics. It was chaotic. There was also poor security. They didn't really understand the art of using fire guards and using sentries and lookouts, so they were kind of easy to sneak up on. They also had poor winter operations. Native Americans weren't used to fighting in the cold. In their culture, Native Americans didn't often fight in the cold because it's so much harder to fight in the cold, and so that led to kind of an Achilles heel for them that the European colonists could exploit when fighting against the Native Americans, was fighting them when it was cold, and they were not prepared for that. Now, as far as all European-style weapons go, forces and tactics, they didn't always work in America. Some weapons that worked really well in linear tactics, like in Europe, where you have all your people in formations going muzzle to muzzle, close combat with other people, everything is linear, highly organized and orchestrated. That's not how we fight in America. They use guerrilla tactics where it's people hiding behind terrain features, it's chaotic, it's not all organized, and fighting muzzle to muzzle. And for that reason, the American rifle was really helpful in this instance. Now, the differences between the American rifle and the muzzle. The musket. The musket has a bayonet, so it's good for close quarters fighting, muzzle to muzzle. Also, a musket can be reloaded more quickly. However, it doesn't have as good of range and accuracy as a rifle does. A rifle has very good range and accuracy, so it's good at shooting against like Native Americans that are hiding far away doing guerrilla tactics. However, the rifle takes a lot of mastery to use because it takes a lot of skill to reload a rifle as opposed to a musket, so it takes more time to reload, and for that reason it has a slower firing rate. So in linear tactics, you're fighting close combat, muzzle to muzzle. You need something that fires quickly, and range and accuracy isn't that important, so you use the musket in linear combat. However, for guerrilla-style tactics like what the Americans were getting used to, you have to use a rifle, where range and accuracy is important, and you have a little bit more time to reload, as opposed to when you're fighting muzzle to muzzle with somebody, and in close combat. So, American rifle, good for guerrilla tactics. The musket's better for European-style warfare, where everything's orchestrated and you're a lot closer to your enemy. The English militia was brought to America. This idea that the citizen soldier could volunteer and wasn't on active duty. And the militia styles varied depending on whether a certain colony was close to a lot of hostile Native Americans or whether a colony wasn't close to a lot of hostile Native Americans and enemies. Of course, the colonies that were closer to the enemies and had to fight a lot more, those militia members were really good at what they did. They were really experienced, whereas other colonies didn't see a lot of action, so their militia wasn't as good. So there was a lot of variation in the quality of militia in different colonies because they all had different levels of action they were used to. There's a lot of variation in how skilled militias are, depending on what their location is and how much experience they have. Although one unifying theme that you see with militias as opposed to active military in these history examples they talk about is discipline problems. A lot of problems with the militia was that they weren't as disciplined and they didn't have the same level of experience. So that's the weakness of the militia system. Notable characteristics of the French and Indian Wars were a mix of tactics. There was the guerrilla-style American tactics, and then there's the conventional linear European tactics where you're fighting muzzle to muzzle and everything's orchestrated and highly organized. And you're out in the open fighting close quarters with your enemy, and you can see them. You can see who you're fighting in European tactics. So at Braddock's defeat, there were a lot of Indians involved there, so they were using guerrilla-style American tactics, whereas in the Battle of Quebec, it was against British, and so they used European tactics where they had linear tactics, and it wasn't really a guerrilla style of fighting. That's what's important to know about Braddock's defeat and the Battle of Quebec, the difference in tactics that were used. Moving right along to what's important for the test. You can read all this if you're interested, although it's not directly testable, but now we get back to the directly testable stuff. The first major battle that they emphasize heavily and they study a lot is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, the Patriots made mistakes and they gave the British a huge advantage, but the British made mistakes too, and they did not take advantage of all the opportunities that the Patriots gave to them. Now, this was a British victory. However, it was a very costly British victory. The British lost about 50% of their people that day that were in that area, including a lot of officers, and it was because of a lot of really dumb mistakes that the British made. The Patriots made some dumb mistakes too, which we'll talk about. So, big thing to know here is there were a lot of mistakes made in terms of surprise, maneuver, unity of command, and security. The Patriots, for example, made a mistake in terms of surprise and maneuver. They put all their people on top of this hill that was out in the open, and it was indefensible. They had no way to defend their people that were out in the open on top of this hill. There was also confusion over who was in command and who they should follow orders from, so there was a problem with unity of command. Now, the British also made another mistake in that they didn't have the element of surprise. They attacked in broad daylight when it's most expected that they would attack, and they forced all of their soldiers out in the open and went up against a fortified position, which we learned you don't do. Well, they did it. They sent all their people up against this hill and did a literal uphill battle, all their people out in the open, no cover, and they just kind of wore themselves down. They just grinded themselves down going up against this hill, and the only reason they lost was because the Patriots killed so many British that they ran out of ammunition and eventually had to leave Bunker Hill because they ran out of ammunition because they put so much lead into the British, and the British just kept sending more people, and instead of changing their tactics and doing some kind of like California, New York kind of squad assault from the side, they just kept going up at the front, and they were like, we're just going to eventually have them run out of ammunition by just sending so many people up there and killing so many British that eventually they're going to have to surrender and leave the hill because they're going to run out of ammunition. And that was, I mean, I guess they technically did win, but at what cost? You know, a lot of British died that didn't even need to. And also, a mistake the British made was that they lost all these people, and back home, back in Great Britain, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, there were commanders who wanted to do this a certain way, whereas in the New World, the commanders that were actually present there had their own idea of what to do, and there was a lot of confusion for unity of command, even for the British too, where they didn't know whose orders to follow. So that's kind of the mistakes that you should understand about Bunker Hill between the Patriots and the British. So again, the themes that you should understand for Bunker Hill that were poorly used: the element of surprise, because the British attacked in broad daylight. They didn't do any kind of like sneaking around. They did like forward assault against the fortified position, so there was no element of surprise from the British. Also, maneuvering. They put all their people up against the fortified position. There was no strategy behind how to maneuver around this hill and take this uphill battle. Unity of command. Both sides were confused about who was in charge. Everybody was giving commands. And so there wasn't really one single path to follow. Also, security. The Patriots were up on top of this hill where they were out in the open, and there was no possible way for them to defend themselves. So there was very poor security in terms of using the terrain to their advantage to find cover. And that's true of both sides, because the British were out in the open. They didn't try anything sneaky or stealthy, and they lost a lot of people. The British did. So those are all the themes that were poorly used in this battle, and a lot of British people died. Even though they won, it was a very costly victory. That's what's important to know about this. And here we talk about how the British took the hill, but half of them died, including a lot of officers. And even though the Patriots lost, I mean, the British really lost so many people that was the victory even worth it? Who knows? But it is debatable as to whether or not it was truly a valuable victory for the British, since they lost so many people. Okay. Moving on to what's important in all of this. The battles of Trenton and Princeton. It was a show of genius from General Washington. He really used the element of surprise because he crossed the Delaware River to attack them on the night before Christmas, and the British assumed that this was a gentleman's war, and so they didn't post any fire guards. They were all drunk from Christmas celebrations, and it was early in the morning, like the sun wasn't even up yet, and the British kind of fought like gentlemen, and they were like, oh, it's early in the morning, no one's going to attack us early in the morning. They were not expecting it at all, and the Patriots were like, you think this is a gentleman's war? We're going to fuck your shit up. And then there were no fire guards that the British posted, and they pretty much caught the British with their pants down, and within about an hour and a half, they had to surrender because the Patriots just slaughtered them, and they were totally not ready for that at all. They had no idea that was coming. And then they pursued to Trenton, and then they beat them up over there and prevented them from sending reinforcements to fortify on the other side of the Delaware River. So it was genius in terms of the surprise. Also, it was very offensive in that they just kept pursuing them all the way to Trenton. You can study this on page 72. It goes into a lot more detail if you want to read in the textbook. It'll help you remember why this battle was so important, and it'll help you kind of understand the strategy that Washington was going towards. At Princeton, they used economy of force and security. But what's really important to understand is that they used also, again, surprise, maneuver, and offensive. After they beat the British at Trenton, they pursued them again all the way up to Princeton. And this was another surprise because they attacked in the morning. And that's not what the British were used to. They weren't expecting it to be early in the morning. And the British lost 3 of their regiments, which meant they lost a lot of people. They got really weak because of this attack. Washington then went into winter quarters in the hills around Morristown, New Jersey, after they beat the British at Princeton, and General Cornwallis had the option of pursuing Washington. He might have cut off his people. A lot of historians believe that if Cornwallis would have just pursued Washington after the victory at Princeton, they might have been able to destroy Washington's force. However, the British did not really use perseverance very well. They were cold, they were tired of fighting, and so they literally would just let Washington go, it's fine. And Washington then left after beating up the British really bad at Trenton and Princeton. It was really embarrassing for the British, and then Washington went out into the woods, and that's when we get to eventually we're going to talk about Valley Forge. It was important. But before that, let's talk about the tactical victories. So in Trenton, that's where a lot of the mercenaries were, the Hessians, the German mercenaries. And because the Patriots killed so many of them on Christmas when they weren't ready to fight, they lost a lot of good people on the British side that time. In Princeton, there were 3 British regiments that were lost. A lot of British supplies were lost because of that. The strategic impact was that the American cause was reinvigorated. Washington was able to get a lot of recruits for the army because a lot of people started to see that the British were vulnerable, actually, and that the Americans might actually have a chance against the British because of this battle. And so for that reason, it really helped to rally American fence-sitters and militia. So a lot of people who were didn't make the decision yet about whether or not they wanted to side with the British or the Patriots saw this battle and the huge victory for Washington, and they realized we should, side with the Patriots because they actually have a chance of winning this war. So it really helped to bolster recruitment for the army and for the militia on the side of the Patriots. And then we have the Saratoga campaign. The principles violated by the British were simplicity, unity of command, and security. So Burgoyne, this guy, he made a really overly complicated plan. He hoped to use maneuver by taking New York State from multiple different directions, which he didn't have to use multiple different directions. He could have just done all of his efforts on one plan, and that would have helped him. So he made his plan overly complicated. If you make your plan overly complicated, it's likely to fail. That's why the principle of simplicity is so important, as seen in this example here. This plan was particularly overly complicated to take New York from different directions because of how complicated the terrain in the area was. As far as unity of command, we see again that the commanders back home on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean had one idea of what they wanted to do, whereas the commanders in the colonies had a different idea. So there was no unity of command. There were different orders, different ideas on what to do. There was not one single idea on what to do. So it was kind of a mess in terms of the planning. A lot of people making their ideas, a lot of people putting in input, and having different ideas on what should be done. There was no single, really, unity of command at Saratoga, which is why the principle violated by the British that they have here is unity of command. And also security, because the plan was overly complicated and everyone was unclear as to what they should do. The result of the Saratoga campaign was that the British failed in their operation. General Burgoyne's army had to surrender, which led to a lot of strategic effects for the Patriots. It snuffed a serious threat to New York and New England. It boosted Patriot morale. And then what was most important was that after the Saratoga campaign and after the British failed to execute this plan, France decided that it was probably a worthy investment to help the Patriots because Britain seems kind of vulnerable. You know, the Patriots keep winning these important battles, and maybe if the French helped, they could help the Patriots defeat their enemy, the British. And so after the Saratoga campaign, France decided to jump on board with the Patriots and help them fight against England. Alright, the next thing, Valley Forge. It talks all about perseverance. That's the biggest thing for Valley Forge, the principle of perseverance. At Valley Forge, it didn't have food, they didn't have supplies, and for that reason there was a lot of unnecessary deaths and unnecessary suffering. Now the thing about Valley Forge is that it shows how important logistics is. Not just having supplies, but the ability to move those supplies where they're needed. There were forts all over in the colonies that had food that was rotting and supplies that weren't being used. However, when Washington and his troops went to Valley Forge after the victories at Trenton and Princeton, they had no way of getting all that food and all those supplies to Valley Forge, and for that reason there was a lot of suffering and a lot of unnecessary deaths. So this really tested the Patriots' perseverance, if they were so willing to win this war that they were able to go through all this suffering at Valley Forge of starving and being uncomfortable. It was winter time, so that made it even more miserable because they were all freezing. And so this was all about perseverance. That's the lesson you learn from Valley Forge. But also understand how important it is to make sure that you can move supplies like food and clothes and medical supplies where they're needed. If you have them, that's great, but if you don't have the ability to move those supplies to wherever they're needed, then it's useless to even have them. That's what Saratoga and then ultimately Valley Forge teaches you. That's why I say not lack of supply, but poor logistical organization. Then we talk about Inspector General Willem von Steuben. Once they were at Valley Forge, this general came and helped train General Washington's soldiers in linear tactics, the way that the British fight, and taught them how to prepare for that. He ran military drills with them. He trained them for fighting against the British, and that really helped the Patriots in future battles when they had successes. It was attributed to the training that they received from General Willem von Steuben at Valley Forge. It really helped turn the tides of the war, the training they got from this general. So that's the end of Lesson 1. Now for Lesson 2. Again, we're going to highlight the directly testable parts. I don't want to waste your time talking about stuff that's not really important. There was the Battle of Monmouth. They analyzed the bad and the good aspects of the United States. It was a weak plan. There was poor execution. There was a British counterattack. It was a crisis overall. Washington rallied troops. They stopped the British counterattack, and the battle ended up as a draw, but it validated Valley Forge improvements in linear tactics. So we talked about how Valley Forge, when Willem von Steuben came and trained Washington's people, he taught them how to fight the way the British do, how to fight in linear tactics. And that training was what led to the Battle of Monmouth being a draw instead of a complete loss for the Patriots, because the Patriots now had training from someone who understood linear tactics of the British and taught them how to fight that way. So it kind of helped them. It wasn't a complete victory for the Patriots, but they did a lot better than they would have done without von Steuben's training in linear tactics. Let me see, what else can we emphasize from here? I want to make sure I got everything in here. What's testable here and important is to understand that the British counterattack at Monmouth failed. And this is because of Washington's leadership, of course, that's a given. And it helped to rally the troops and demoralize the British counterattack. The third bullet, which is testable on this slide, is that the battle wasn't a big tactical victory for the U.S., but it showed that the Valley Forge training in linear tactics was having results. It showed that the Continental's armies, regular troops, could hold up against British regulars in open terrain by using conventional linear tactics. So after Valley Forge and von Steuben, the draw at Monmouth showed that the Patriots could hold up against the British out in open, fighting against them in linear tactics, because they're doing better now. They're not just losing completely, now it's kind of a draw. They can kind of hold their own against the British. That's what's important to know about Monmouth. Next, the British start moving towards the south. They talk about the Waxhaws battle. Tarleton's troops came across some surrendering patriots, and they asked, was this a good use of the principle of restraint? No, it was not. It was a terrible use of the principle of restraint. Tarleton caught a bunch of patriots in a southern invasion when they're trying to take the southern colonies, and they all surrendered, but Tarleton had his people just kill them all anyway, even though they surrendered. And that was really bad because it was so brutal, and it showed how brutal the British were, that it actually rallied a bunch of patriots to start joining into the militia and joining the army because they saw how awful the British were. And so it kind of helped to fortify the Patriots' cause because they used this brutal lack of restraint whenever they killed all these patriots that surrendered to them. And that's what's important about the Waxhaws battle. The Waxhaws battle showed a poor use of the principle of restraint because Tarleton slaughtered a bunch of people who surrendered to him, and then instead of, I guess they hoped that would eventually make everyone afraid of the British and make everybody give up, but it did just the opposite. Slaughtering all those people who surrendered actually encouraged a lot of people to enlist in the militia and start fighting the British and hating the British. So that's why principle of restraint is so important, because a lot of times if you don't use restraint, it's not going to scare people, it'll just make them angry, and it'll start to move people against your cause, and you'll make more enemies if you fail to use restraint. That's why the Waxhaws battle was so important. Alright? I want to impact regarding popular support and Patriot guerrilla warfare. Yeah, so it rallied a lot of support for the Patriots. We're moving along now. As far as guerrilla actions, Francis Marion was really notable, known as the Swamp Fox. Once the British took down the southern colonies, there was a lot of resistance. Francis Marion was a patriot who led a lot of guerrilla tactics against the British that were holding down the southern colonies. and for that reason there was a lot of guerrilla popular support. What's what they mean by guerrilla popular support? Once the British took down the southern colonies, there was a lot of guerrilla tactics used against them for resistance against them. The guerrilla targets, however, were not the British main force. Guerrilla tactics typically aren't strong enough to go muzzle to muzzle and just like fly out in an open field and go and start shooting redcoats. Instead, they had to be more sneaky, so they went out against outposts, forts. They attacked lines of communication by disrupting lines of communication. We saw in the example from Valley Forge how important it is to be able to move supplies where they're needed, and so guerrilla tactics, their main goal was to do things like, for instance, set up an ambush of supply lines to prevent supply lines from getting where they needed to go, which is a really good way of taking down your enemy. And so what's important to know about these guerrilla tactics, led by people like Francis Marion, is that their targets were not the main British force. It was their outposts, it was their lines of communication, it was being sneaky, and it was just a resistance force, right? It wasn't like a full-on army. It was just a bunch of people that were leading a resistance, doing guerrilla tactics, taking down and disrupting lines of communication, and harassing outposts. But while that's not as big picture as going straight up against the British main force, all those guerrilla tactics did play a key role in weakening British occupation of the southern colonies. And that guy is Francis Marion. He was the most notable person who was leading these guerrilla tactics in the South, and that's why Francis Marion is so important. And then we have the battle at Kings Mountain. What's important to know here, they talk about it in this text down here. The battle hurt British legitimacy. Patriot militia units crushed the British-led Tory force. News of Tories are people who are American colonists, but they side with the British. So even though they live in America, they're not fighting for America. They're actually siding with the British, and they're fighting for the British. And this led to a lot of problems because they found that these Tories were actually really demanding. They were not really perseverant. They had they were very high maintenance, and they weren't really good at fighting, and so the Tories weren't very much help. And the battle at Kings Mountain kind of showed that the Tories were not really going to help the British win this war. News of the defeat dampened the Tory support, which was important to British Southern's campaign. So because of the loss at Kings Mountain, a lot of people who sided with British didn't want to fight for the British anymore because they saw that they were losing a lot of battles, you know? So it kind of helped to slow down the rate at which people in America were joining the British to help them. And then going forward, which is also important, in spite of growing problems in South Carolina, Cornwallis planned an invasion to demonstrate to all Southerners that it was futile to resist the British, that the British were powerful enough that they would win eventually. He hoped it would be the decisive campaign in the theater, assisted by the Virginia Raid that they talked about in the textbook, which isn't important for the test, but if you're interested, you can read about it. Then, in the second bullet, the Tory force helped to spread the Tory gospel in Carolina West Country. Then angry Patriot militia units rose up to corner and smash them at Kings Mountain. So, at Kings Mountain, it was a loss for the British, and it showed to people who were still loyal to British that it might not be such a good idea to help the British because they're not doing that great. And the Patriots, the Americans, actually stand a chance at winning this war. So that's what's important about Kings Mountain. It was in the southern colonies, part of the Southern campaigns. The British were trying to get a bunch of American citizens to turn against the Patriots and fight for them, but the loss at Kings Mountain showed everybody that the British aren't so great, and it might not be such a great idea to help the British and to fight for the British. That's not testable. This isn't testable. METTC, the comments say cover this if it has been covered before, but we all know about METTC, so let's just skip it and talk about what's directly testable. Then the Battle of Cowpens. It talks about what principles Morgan used. He used mass, surprise, maneuver, and economy of force. The two themes that are important for the test is that at the Battle of Cowpens, Morgan's used maneuver and surprise, and we're going to talk about why this is. Morgan used his militia as an economy of force. He basically did a feint. He put all of his militia members up at the front to fire against the British, and then once the British got close, he told his militia people to fall back and act like they were retreating. And then, of course, the British chase after them because it was just militia. It was just a small group of militia. And they're like, oh, they're retreating. We can take them. This will be easy. And so the British pursued them, right? They're chasing after these militia people who are pretending to be retreating. And then what was waiting for them at the end was the Continental Army. So they lured all the British to chase them up until this hill where all of the Continental Army at the time in this area was located, and then once the British got close, they just fired on them like super hard, killed a bunch of them. It was a huge slaughter for the British. And then if that wasn't bad enough, then Morgan flanked them on the side, prevented them from being able to retreat, and just killed even more of them. So many British died, and so it was the element of surprise because they faked a retreat. It was an element of maneuver because they cleverly lured them into this trap. It was also the element of the economy of force because he put only a few of his militiamen at the front to pretend to retreat, and then he put his Continental Army behind them on a hill to shoot all the people, all the British when they got too close. So the use of economy of force, they explain it here, it was an allocation of minimal essential combat power to a secondary effort. The secondary effort was the militia who were pretending to retreat, and that was an effort to support the main action. The main action being the Continental Army, regulars that were on the hill that were going to start shooting all the British once they got close, too close to retreat quickly. And so this was known as like one of the most brilliant plans in American military history, especially for the Revolutionary War. Economy of force also brings up mass. Morgan's commitment of cavalry and militia against Tarleton's increasingly exposed flanks was a case of Morgan concentrating the effects of combat power at the decisive place in time. So what they're talking about here was how he used his cavalry to flank the British once they got close, and he used his militia to engage them and then pretend to retreat in order to lure them into the trap where the Continental Army just opened fire on them and they all got slaughtered. And this luring effect also had the British organize themselves in a way where their flanks were exposed. And that's when Morgan sent in his cavalry and flanked them and then just dealt the final blow that killed off a bunch of these British. And so this was a huge victory for Morgan, and it was really brilliant how he made this strategy. Alright, so you can read about that. It's important. The Battle of Cowpens. That's the Battle of Cowpens. Let's move on to the directly testable stuff. The Yorktown Campaign. This was the French fleet's most important role. It talks about whether or not it was from the fire support or cutting a line of communication. So they did provide fire support, but that was something the Patriots already had. So that wasn't what was really so important about the French's help at the Yorktown Campaign. What was super important was that it cut a line of communication, meaning it cut logistical support to the British, and the British were basically isolated and had no way of getting more troops to them, and they had no way of getting supplies to them, and they were essentially cornered in, and their surrender was just a matter of time at this point, because the French Navy was able to disrupt their lines of communication along the coast, along the sea, so that way they were basically landlocked and had no way of getting new supplies to them, and the Patriots and the French had them surrounded. To go into detail about this, so again, it wasn't the fire support, it was the fact that the French Navy was able to cut an important line of communication, which was logistical support. Washington's move from New York City to Yorktown and the mechanics of the ground siege are noteworthy, but Yorktown offers an opportunity to discuss effective joint operations. Joint operations meaning between the French and the Patriots. Review page 101. It'll help you understand all the context and what's important here. What's really testable and important here is that the French fleet blocked the Royal Navy's access into Chesapeake Bay. Since Cornwallis was already isolated at Yorktown from the land side, isolating them on the Chesapeake Bay, when the French fleet isolated the Chesapeake Bay in the waters, it led Cornwallis to be completely isolated, both on the land side and from the sea. Cornwallis had no way to escape. He had no way to get more supplies, both people and ammunition. People and supplies basically could not be fed in to the British anymore because the French now were blockading Chesapeake Bay, and so the Royal Navy was basically useless at this point. And the Franco-American siege was complete with no breaks, and Cornwallis' surrender became a matter of time, basically. So what's important here was the disruption of a line of communication. That's why the Yorktown campaign and the French contribution was so important. It disrupted a line of communication. As for the Newburgh affair, this was basically, the war was coming to an end, and then all of the Patriot officers that fought for the Americans started to worry about what would happen to them. How would the new American government treat them? And they were, of course, hesitant to think anything good, and they decided to basically protest. They threatened to stop fighting the British, and they threatened to not put their guns away and not put down their arms once the war was over, if they didn't get all their pay that they were promised and all the things they were promised for fighting in the war. And Washington helped support his officers. He influenced Congress to give them all the pay they were due. In the end, eventually the officers ended up pledging their loyalty to Congress, and this was a precedent for the civil-military relationship. After this, General Washington wasn't really trusting of a strong military, active army focus. After this, General Washington decided that the new nation, after the Revolutionary War, should really heavily emphasize militia. Militia. Why militia? Number one, the nation's broke. America's broke, and it can't afford a full active duty army all the time. Secondly, he realized that having a strong active military component could actually encroach upon citizens' freedoms and rights. It could be just like what they just escaped, right? A tyrannical force with the government having too much power. The founding fathers didn't like the government having too much power, and having active military be a huge presence was kind of like having too much power for the government. Also, it would lead to more taxes. The whole reason behind the war starting, of course, was too much taxation. So they didn't want to just jump out of the frying pan and into the grease again by having a huge active military component with lots of taxation. So Washington was all about basically National Guard and militia being the main focus of American military. And he thought that the active duty component should be a small part, because otherwise you're going to have to tax your citizens to death. The nation's already broke, and the Newburgh affair, where American officers were protesting and fighting against Congress, made Washington believe that a strong active duty military component might actually harass civilian affairs, civilian government like Congress, and So basically, having a huge active military component isn't so great for the ideas of freedom and all that stuff that the founding fathers were so passionate about. And that's what the precedent for civil military relationship that they're talking about here. These notes here at the bottom are pretty important. So, what's testable here? Washington didn't want a big standing army. He did not want the army coercing the civilian government, in this case Congress, to do what they wanted. The class should review 107 and 108 in the textbook. Congress gave the officers some of what they wanted in the end, but what else is important here? Also, for the fourth bullet, what's testable? It reinforces the previous bullets. In this incident, George Washington suppressed the budding challenge by Continental Army officers against the Army's civilian bosses in the Continental Congress. It thus helped establish the civilian authority as superior to the military in United States affairs. This is an important but little-known event in our history. Most independence movements and revolutions in world history haven't turned out as well. The affair is also a nice example of ethical and dynamic on-scene leadership, which Washington definitely showed here. So basically it's saying what's testable here is that, in this case, the American military was trying to twist the arm of civilian government, being Congress in this case, to giving them what they wanted, and that gave Washington the idea that having a huge active military component would lead them to the same thing they just escaped, a tyrannical government with too much power. And so to limit the government's power, he emphasized that militia was best. Having a huge militia was best, and making sure that every male between the ages of 18 and 45 was trained in military and was basically on reserve status or National Guard status, because having an active military is expensive, and it also leads to less freedom and possibly a tyrannical government in the future. So Washington's preference, again, was small army, but bigger militia. The emphasis was on a militia, because a big army could encroach upon the freedoms and rights of a civilian government like Congress. The first bullet reinforces the testable previous slides. Points about Washington's druthers. Basically just what we talked about here is what you should understand. The way they structured the military after this, the president was the commander-in-chief of all the services, including the militia, when it's called into federal service. However, Congress has the power to raise and support armies. So basically, Congress has the ability to fund armies and to come up with the plan for how to train them, and the president has the ability to be a commander of the militia once they're called onto federal missions and federal status. However, this checks and balances, checks and balances of power is because Congress has the ability to fund and support the armies, but the president has a role as commander-in-chief of all the services, including the militia, whenever they're on federal orders. However, only Congress has the power to declare war formally, but the president can commit troops to undeclared combat. However, he's still accountable for what they do. So this is kind of how Congress and the president's powers over the military balance each other out in terms of the militia. Separation of powers and checks and balances applies here. States and the U.S. Congress both share control of the militia. Specifically, Congress organizes, they arm them, and they discipline the militia, whereas states are able to appoint the officers of the militia, and states are the ones that actually conduct the training. The U.S. Congress and the U.S. President and states, as far as they're concerned, Congress has the ability to call militias into federal service when needed, and then the President, after that point, becomes the commander-in-chief of the militia. And this is only when the militia are called into federal service. So Congress can call the militia into federal service, and then from that point, after that, then the President is commander-in-chief of those militia men once they're called in federal service by Congress. And so this is how the President and the Congress kind of balance each other's powers out. This is also how the National Guard came to be born. No one United States no single state in the United States exercises exclusive control over their militia, what's now known as the National Guard. The key takeaway for the test is that the reason for the militia slash National Guard name change comes later, and yes, there are different types of state militias even today, but in general, these are the constitutional guidelines. And the bullets here should be self-explanatory. Basically, the takeaway here is that there's a separation of power and of checks and balances between the states, between U.S. Congress, and between the president. Again, Congress organizes, arms, and disciplines the militia. The states appoint the officers in the militia, and they actually conduct the training. And then U.S. Congress has the ability to bring the militia into federal status for federal missions, at which point then the president takes over as commander-in-chief. So everybody has limitations of power and control over the militia. For Harmer and St. Clair's defeats, the examples we learned here were of bad discipline and bad security. Wayne's expedition was much better training and better discipline and better security. Wayne won a lot of battles, which led to a treaty being drawn up. This was during Washington's Indian Wars and trying to secure the Old Northwest, and it was between the American settlers versus the Indians and the British. So the British were occupied with their own wars back in Europe against Napoleon, and for that reason, Canada wasn't as well guarded because the British were preoccupied fighting battles of their own, and so the Americans tried to take advantage of that by exerting their sovereignty by trying to invade Canada. But of course the Indians sided with the British, and so they had to fight against a bunch of Indians, and it talks off starting about Harmer and St. Clair's defeats. So basically Harmer and St. Clair and also Wayne were all doing the same thing. They were trying to go up north, trying to establish American sovereignty, trying to get into Canada, invade Canada, but Harmer and St. Clair were defeated. They had really bad results, whereas Wayne had really good results, and he even led to a treaty being drawn. That's what's testable here. Understanding that Wayne was good, Harmer and St. Clair were bad. They led to a lot of losses from Harmer and St. Clair. This is because Harmer and St. Clair were saddled with untrained militia, and regular army levies consisted of local cast-offs. Whereas Wayne had a lot of time to train and discipline his forces well, so there was better training and discipline of forces, which is why Wayne had a lot of success, as opposed to Harmer and St. Clair. Next, the 1792 Acts. There were a lot of benefits and drawbacks from here. There was no means of arming and disciplining militia, which is what the Constitution charged Congress to do. There were serious limits on service. Militia did not serve any more than 3 months a year, and they could not serve outside the United States. Again, the reason for these limits on militia was that they didn't want to give too much power to the military. They feared that a powerful military would lead to an overly powerful government and a tyrannical government with too many taxes and too much power, like what they just escaped in the Revolutionary War when they escaped from Britain, and they didn't want to go back to that. That's what's important there. And then we have Thomas Jefferson. He cut the Army and the Navy because Thomas Jefferson was just like Washington. He was distrustful of a powerful military, and so he did a lot of cuts to the Army and Navy, but he also established a military academy at West Point because he thought that it was still important to have well-trained officers who knew what they were doing, while not also having an overly large and massive army. He also decided to get the Army involved in the Lewis and Clark military expedition of the Louisiana Purchase, and the Lewis and Clark military expedition was a huge success, and it showed just how important the Army was to the American government and what they could accomplish. So what's important here? The testable parts of the slide support the test question about the early republic. John Adams' term rates, a quick review as time permits. So the second bullet here is what's testable, what's in red. Jefferson, there was an unsatisfactory supply system, which was made worse by Jefferson's policies. These would remain in place until the War of 1812 and will affect that war seriously. Jefferson did create the U.S. Military Academy and sent military officers William Clark and Meriwether Lewis on an expedition to examine the massive Louisiana Purchase, which they just got from France. So that's the testable material here, what we just talked about. Here's a little summary about what was important about what we just read. The objectives and reality for the War of 1812. There was lots of militia, but there were a lot of restrictions on the militia. They couldn't be sent overseas to foreign lands, and they couldn't serve more than 3 months a year. There was also an issue with poor discipline and poor training, and also there was really bad logistics still. They still hadn't mastered the art of logistics, and so there was a bad issue with supply. The U.S. aims for the War of 1812, because it is important to understand this. The whole reason for the War of 1812 and going into Canada was that they wanted to reduce the Indian threats. There were a lot of Indians up there, and they were allying with the British, and they wanted to put an end to that. And they also wanted to confirm their sovereignty. They wanted to prove that America was its own nation. They wanted to secure their borders and just show that they could hold their own against foreign lands, foreigners. However, the United States attempted to take Canada, but this was very poorly executed. This was due to bad preparation, bad leadership, unsatisfactory supply, and limits on the militia, which we talked about earlier. And all those reasons led to a poor campaign in trying to take land in Canada away from the British. What's really important, though, to talk about in these slides is the British and Indian victory at Detroit. The British force included Tecumseh and his followers. Tecumseh was an Indian who didn't like the idea of Americans expanding westward and into the northwest and taking over more land, and so he fought against them, and other Indians considered supporting British and Tecumseh. So Tecumseh was allied with the British, and they were both trying to prevent the Americans from expanding their borders westward or northwest and north into Canada. The Detroit campaign here is what's testable in the second bullet. This is where Tecumseh, the Indian, and his followers joined the British, and their victory at Detroit revived the cause. So they wanted Detroit, and it really helped the Indians see that maybe if they aligned with the British, they might help to prevent the Americans from expanding westward and taking more of their land. In the next slide, we talk about the Detroit front battles had operational and strategic impact. They wanted to keep the U.S. sovereignty in the Old Northwest, and they wanted to reduce the Indian threat. Okay, we talked about that. There was also the United States Naval Force, which beat a British flotilla in the Battle of Lake Erie. So Lake Erie was a big deal because the U.S. Navy actually was able to defeat the British occupation of Lake Erie, and that helped to secure the Detroit front line of communications and forced the British to retreat. So once the United States Navy took Lake Erie, it disrupted the line of communications to the British, and the British had to retreat, and now the Americans had Lake Erie. The United States Army force then beat the British and Indian force at Thames River, and at Thames River is where Tecumseh was killed. The British-Indian threat in the Detroit theater was ended after Tecumseh died at the Battle of Thames, at the Thames River. Understand that once the United States Navy took Lake Erie, it disrupted a line of communications to the British, which is why the British surrendered. Then there was a civil war between the Creek Civil War. After Tecumseh died, there were a bunch of Indians that were still loyal to him. They were called the Red Stick Creeks. But then there were also Indians that were loyal to the Americans, known as the Loyal Creeks. And this was in the Deep South. The Red Sticks killed a bunch of people at a fort. It led to a lot of wars fighting against the Red Sticks, meaning the people who were still loyal to Tecumseh and the British and trying to prevent the Americans from expanding their borders. The Red Sticks lost several conventional defensive battles. The Horseshoe Bend was the most decisive one. So Horseshoe Bend is important to know because this is where, during the Civil War, the Loyal Creeks really beat up a lot of the Red Sticks, and it really hurt their cause. After the Red Stick defeat, most of the Indian threat was dealt with. The testable parts of the slide support the test question. Okay, first bullet. Testable is the fact that Tecumseh's message of Indian unity, Indian religion, and Indian resistance to white expansion affected some of the Creeks. This inspired a civil war between Tecumseh's Creek followers, named the Red Sticks, and the Creeks who spurned Tecumseh's rebellious message in favor of loyalty to the United States. Known in this course as the Loyal Creeks, which we talked about. That's not something covered in the book, but it is something that is testable here. What's testable here that's not covered in the book is that the Red Sticks are the bad Indians who are loyal to Tecumseh, and then there are the Loyal Creeks, the Indians who are loyal to the United States, and there was a civil war between them, fighting against each other. The second bullet, the Creek Civil War, culminated in a summer massacre of whites and Loyal Creeks by Red Sticks at Fort Mims. That was the fort attack I talked about. The attack alarmed the U.S. and especially United States Southerners who believed the British were behind it. So after these bad Indians, the Red Sticks, attacked this American fort, the Americans believed the British were behind it because this was during the War of 1812 when America was fighting Britain for land. The third bullet, the map shows 3 U.S. forces advancing into Creek territory to defeat the Red Sticks. They all encountered problems with militia enlistment, duration, and bad logistics. However, the big error from Tennessee indicates that Andrew Jackson's campaign prevailed in spite of these problems. The fourth bullet, which is also testable here, is that the Indian Wars saw relatively little of the guerrilla-style fighting one associates with Native American warfare. For reasons best known to the Red Sticks, they mostly tried to defend fixed positions and set-piece battles. The best example is the decisive last battle at Horseshoe Bend, which effectively crushed the Creek Red Stick resistance. So what's testable here is that the battle at Horseshoe Bend was what led to the Native American resistance being crushed. And then we have the battle at Niagara front, on the Niagara front. There was improved leadership, training, and discipline by United States Army regulars on the Niagara front. Winfield, Scott, and regulars were involved in this. No big victories, but improved performance versus British regulars and outside the U.S. So even though there wasn't a lot of big victories, it showed that the American militia was able to hold their own against the British. That's what's important about the Niagara front, the battles on the Niagara front. The first bullet and sub-bullets, what's testable here, is that on the Niagara front, leaders like Winfield Scott led well-trained and disciplined regulars into Canada, and that they fought British regulars to a standstill in conventional linear tactics battles. Scott gets the testable attention in this campaign because we're going to see more of him later. So now about Winfield Scott. He's on page 137 and 142 if you want to read about him. He led regulars into Canada. He didn't do that bad in fighting against the British, which showed that the American militiamen could hold their own against the British. Alright, more testable stuff here. There was a huge U.S. militia failure at Bladensburg. They all retreated, and it was very poorly orchestrated. It was very chaotic. It was a bunch of people running away in a disorganized fashion, which showed how poorly trained this militia was, and it showed how poor the leadership in this militia was. The second bullet, which is testable, the key takeaway is that poor militia performance based in part on poor preparation. The point is that the country lacked a policy to ensure the militia was better trained. At Bladensburg, untrained militia received mixed signals from commanders and ended up running from the field in disorder, hence the term the Bladensburg races. Sidebar attributes the loss more to the mixed-up command, but the militia still broke and ran when a more disciplined, controlled retreat was needed. So they needed a really controlled and disciplined retreat. However, the retreat was terrible. Everybody was doing their own thing. Everybody was running away, doing what they wanted. There was no organization. It was just chaos, and it showed how poorly trained this instance of this militia was in this case. Really embarrassing for the American militia. That, again, is the battle at Bladensburg. However, there was a better militia performance at North Point, east of town, at Fort McHenry. They stopped the British ground attack, and there was much better resolve in leadership. What's testable here is understanding the difference between North Point and what happened at Bladensburg. At Bladensburg, the militia had piss-poor performance, whereas at North Point, they had a much more improved performance of the militia. Next, at Lake Champlain, it was a naval battle near Plattsburgh that was decisive. The United States won. The British lost control of the lake and the line of communications, which led to an end of the invasion. It confirmed that the United States was sovereign in the Northeast Theater, and now the United States secured their borders along the north. They had the Great Lakes now. They had Lake Champlain. This loss and the one at Baltimore convinced the British to sign a peace treaty in December. So this Lake Champlain battle was so bad for the British that it led them to eventually sign a peace treaty to the War of 1812. The third, fourth, and fifth bullets here, what's testable, the naval battle of Lake Champlain had operational and strategic impact. It was a major factor in securing the New York front, which in turn supported the U.S. war aim of confirming the sovereignty of its possessions. The American fleet won the battle, and its control of the Lake Champlain, that is, denied the British an avenue of approach and a line of communications to go deep into New York. And eventually the British had to retreat back into Canada. Lake Champlain. Then we talk about the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans. Jackson was successful in defending New Orleans. He showed strong leadership with diverse troops, including militia forces. The testable takeaway is that Jackson's leadership melded a diverse group of troops, including militia, to defend New Orleans successfully. Like North Point, the fight showed that militia could do well in War of 1812 battles. One of the success factors for Jackson was terrain, and though that factor is not testable, it was worth a brief discussion, but we won't talk about it because it's not directly testable. You can read about it if you want, if you're interested. Let's just focus on the testable stuff. So, big summary here for the War of 1812. They wanted to take British Canada from the British. However, this was a failed endeavor due to poor logistical support mostly. They wanted to defeat the Indian threat, and this was successful because the Old Northwest and part of the South was secured from the Indian threat after Tecumseh died and after the Civil War between the Red Sticks and the good Indians, and the Red Sticks lost. They failed to control all of North America, again, because they failed to take British Canada. They wanted to end Royal Navy harassment. They wanted to confirm their sovereignty. This was successful because naval victories on the lakes helped at critical times. At Lake Erie, at Lake Champlain, they were able to take those lakes away from the British Navy and disrupt lines of communication, which led to the British retreating to Canada, and the Americans were able to hold their border on the north because of the victories at these lakes. This check on learning, let's talk about it. Did the pre-war supply and militia policies prepare the U.S. well for this war? No. For example, was supply delivery for campaigns good? No, it was not. Supply delivery was terrible for those campaigns. How well did the militia perform at Bladensburg? The militia performed terribly at Bladensburg. Bladensburg showed just how poorly some of these militia were prepared for fighting. Did the battles of Lake Erie and Lake Champlain have any operational or strategic effect upon the war? Yes, they did. The United States Navy beat off the British Navy, and because of that, they had to retreat because lines of communication were disrupted, because there was no more logistical supply to the British, and so that was the strategic effect upon the war whenever they took Lake Erie and Lake Champlain. It also helped to enforce United States sovereignty on their northern border between United States and British Canada. In the Niagara Front battles, did aggressive combat leaders like Winfield Scott show that U.S. Army regulars improved their ability to fight outside the U.S. against British regulars? Yes, it did. The Niagara Front battles showed that leaders like Winfield Scott and the U.S. Army regulars could be successful in their ability to fight on foreign lands against British regulars. And so at the Niagara Front battles, Winfield Scott showed that the United States Army could handle fighting on foreign lands against people as competent as British regulars. That was what's important about Niagara Front battles. Then, had militia performance improved in late war battles like North Point and New Orleans? Yes, it had. What's so important about North Point was that it showed a drastic difference in militia competency as opposed to the battle at Bladensburg. And then also Jackson was successful in defending New Orleans from the British. No, the militia did not flee in disorder in these examples. And let's review what they say about this. Nothing helpful. Just listen to what I said. Okay, moving on now to the end of Lesson 2 and the first quarter of American military history. The Second Seminole War was a war against Native Americans, and it was ultimately a success. It was a relentless year-round campaign with better transport. So here, the American military learned from their mistakes in the War of 1812, when there was a lot of logistical problems. They got better at transporting materials and people, which led to good victories with the Second Seminole War. Also, we talked about how the militia could only serve 3 months a year, and that led to some problems. Well, now they have people who can serve in year-round campaigns, and serving in year-round campaigns really helped to exhaust the Native Americans' ability to resist. And because they were serving year-round campaigns, they eventually won because the Native Americans couldn't hold off against them in year-round campaigns. So nearly all, but not all, of the Seminoles had to be transferred along the Trail of Tears into Arkansas, away from where they were originally, where they were chased out of. The first two sub-bullets are covered. The effect is obvious. More mobile forces campaigning year-round gave the Seminoles no rest, and so for that reason the Seminoles lost their food and supplies. They had no choice but to go west. So that's testable. And then what else is testable was talking about how almost all the Seminoles had to be transferred west out of their home after the Second Seminole War. Alright, now we finally have a check on learning to sum all this up, and we'll go over the questions that they ask here. Fort Harmer, St. Clair, and Wayne's expeditions in the Old Northwest compare their troop discipline, use of security, and overall success. So Harmer and St. Clair, they had a poor expedition because their people were poorly trained, poorly disciplined, and for that reason, they had failures. However, Wayne's expedition in the Old Northwest was much more successful because their troops were better trained and better disciplined, and they had a better use of security. Basically, okay? Understanding the difference between Fort Harmer and St. Clair. Harmer and St. Clair, same thing. They failed. Wayne, however, was successful. That's the different one. Wayne was the different one. Harmer and St. Clair, however, were both failures. Early in the War of 1812, on the Detroit front, did Tecumseh enjoy combat success? Early in the war, he did. He was doing well early in the war. And this led to a lot of Indians, yes. Better support among Indians, yes, it did. Because Tecumseh was originally successful, a lot of Indians followed him. He was a good leader at first. However, his ultimate fate was that he died. He died after the battle at Detroit, and that eventually led to the Civil War between the Red Sticks, which were the bad Indians, and the loyal Indians, because a lot of people still wanted to carry on his cause after he died. But it was a failure, and the Red Stick Indians failed, and the good Indians and the Americans prevailed in that instance. So even after Tecumseh died, some people still wanted to follow in his legacy and fight against the Americans, but the Americans won anyway. Did Tecumseh have any effect upon the Creek Indians? Yeah, that's what I just talked about. Describe the result among the Creeks. So there was a civil war, right? There was the good Creeks that were loyal to the Americans and the bad Creeks. Then there was the Red Stick Creeks, and they started fighting against each other. That was the Civil War. How did the Red Sticks fight the U.S. in the Creek War? Guerrilla tactics or defensive battles. So it was defensive battles, right? This was an interesting fight because the Red Sticks changed the way that they fought. Usually Native Americans fought with guerrilla tactics. However, in this case, when the Red Sticks were fighting the U.S. in the Creek War, they had defensive battles where they were defending all of their posts that they had instead of using guerrilla tactics, which was interesting because that's more of a organized way of fighting. So it kind of showed how these Native Americans were adapting to the United States way of fighting, the same way that the United States early on had to adapt to the Native Americans way of fighting. So here, the art of warfare is kind of adaptable, right? It changes depending on what situation you're in. Describe factors for U.S. Army success in the Second Seminole War. Did it campaign year-round or avoid summer campaigns? No, it did not avoid summer campaigns. It was a campaign year-round in the Second Seminole War, which exhausted the Seminoles' supply of food and supplies. So campaigning year-round was what led to the Second Seminole War being a success for the Americans. Did it improve transportation? Yes. Because of this, the Americans learned their lesson from the War of 1812, and they improved transportation and lines of communication and logistical support. That was what's so important about the Second Seminole War. It improved transportation and lines of communication. Did it remove all the Seminoles? No, it did not. It removed almost all of them. Almost all the Seminoles had to evacuate their homes and moved westward along the Trail of Tears, but some of them stayed, so it was not all the Seminoles. All right, and that's the check on learning, and that concludes lesson 2, and this now covers we now covered about a quarter of the material for military history.